Imagine growing up believing you were dying. Wheelchair, feeding tubes, dozens of diagnoses, all lies. The person hurting you was not a stranger, was not a kidnapper. It was your own mother. This is the story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, a girl trapped in a life carefully staged for sympathy, and to the only escape she saw left someone dead. From the outside, the story looked like a miracle of endurance and unconditional love. A devoted mother and her fragile daughter, living day to day with a catalog of devastating illnesses, smiling bravely through hospital corridors and charity events. Neighbors brought casseroles, doctors signed forms, foundations donated trips, and a pink house built by good intentions. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, small in stature, soft-spoken, often photographed in bright costumes or princess wigs, seemed like the embodiment of resilience. Sitting in a wheelchair, fed through tubes, said to suffer from leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, asthma, and countless allergies, she appeared to be a child who had been sick for as long as anyone could remember. Standing behind her, always answering first, always filling in the medical details, was her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard. To the world, she was a heroic caregiver who had given up everything to keep her child alive. But what people saw from the sidewalk, through staged smiles and practice stories, was only a carefully constructed surface. It was a performance honed over years doctors changed. Cities moved, records lost or replaced until a narrative of illness hardened into unquestioned fact. Those who met Dee Dee rarely thought to challenge her. She spoke with the confidence of someone used to being believed, listing diagnoses with medical fluency. She projected exhaustion and competence at the same time. Beneath that performance, however, a very different reality was quietly taking shape. Inside the small home, the boundary between care and control had long since disappeared. Munchausen syndrome by proxy, though the term itself was never spoken aloud in that house, was the logic, organizing daily life. Gypsy's hair was shaved not because of chemotherapy, but because it will fall out anyway. Wheelchairs and medications were presented as necessity, not choice. Medical procedures multiplied, many of them invasive, based on symptoms reported by Dee Dee rather than experienced by Gypsy. Doctors who asked too many questions were replaced with others more willing to accept the story already written for them. When test results came back normal, Dee Dee had explanations. When Gypsy expressed doubt, Dee Dee had threats. To be a child in that environment was to be taught that your own body could not be trusted, and that your mother's version of you was more real than anything you felt. Gypsy was told she was years younger than she truly was. She was told her muscles could not support her weight, even when, in moments when no one was watching, she knew she could stand. She learned that curiosity was dangerous, that medical authority could be bent by confidence, and that saying "I feel fine" was not just wrong, it was disloyal. The world outside the front door was framed as frightening, full of infections and dangers she was too weak to face. Dependence was not a side effect. It was the point. The public saw generosity and rallied around it. Charities provided travel to theme parks. Celebrities posed for photos. Neighbors mowed the lawn and spoke in hushed voices about courage. Every gesture of support reinforced the story's truth. And for Gypsy, every donation, every sympathetic smile at a restaurant where the bill was quietly paid, became further proof that there was no way out other than obedience. She was living a narrative authored by someone else, one where she was sick, permanently childlike, permanently in need. Abuse came wrapped in pastel blankets and medical language, difficult to name because it did not look like the forms of cruelty people expect. Moments of doubt surfaced like cracks in glass. Gypsy noticed that some medications made her feel worse, not better. She realized that her legs worked better than she had been told. She heard whispers from doctors who were uncertain but unwilling to pursue confrontation. Yet even those small realizations crashed against the reality of her dependence. Her identification documents, her access to others, even her understanding of her own age and history were controlled by Dee Dee. When she asked questions, the consequences were immediate raised voices, guilt, reminders of everything her mother had sacrificed, sometimes physical intimidation. Silence became self-protection. The emotional landscape of the house was shaped by gratitude demanded and fear enforced. Dee Dee moved smoothly between tenderness and punishment. One moment, she was a doting caretaker, arranging stuffed animals on the bed. The next, she was warning Gypsy that without her, doctors would let her die, or the world would not understand her conditions. That mixture of love and threat created a psychological cage stronger than any lock. Gypsy learned that resistance did not simply risk anger, it risked abandonment, or worse, exposure as ungrateful, which in their small universe felt like a moral crime. This was not a single dramatic incident, but a long accumulation of days structured around appointments, pill schedules, and the stories told to sustain them. Time itself blurred. Childhood milestones were replaced by hospital bracelets. Instead of school relationships and independence, Gypsy's world consisted of television, online glimpses of other lives, and the constant presence of her mother. The line between real illness and invented illness, between care and control, was deliberately smudged until Gypsy herself struggled to distinguish which parts of her were authentic and which had been scripted for her. The community, unknowingly, became part of theater. Reporters wrote human interest pieces. Volunteers built ramps, while meaning donors reaffirmed a narrative that made them feel compassionate and useful. Few paused to ask why so many illnesses clustered in one small body, why paperwork did not align, or why a girl who seemed cognitively younger was also startlingly articulate and bright when allowed to speak for herself. Belief felt kinder than skepticism. And so the myth grew. For Dee Dee, attention and validation acted like oxygen. Every sympathetic nod reinforced her control. Every doctor's signature deepened her authority over Gypsy's life. It is tempting to imagine a moment when this could have been interrupted an appointment where someone insisted on independent verification, a neighbor who listened more closely. But those moments passed, and the story moved forward, acquiring momentum. Systems that should have recognized risk failed in quiet ways. Fragmented record, professional courtesy, the reluctance to challenge a caregiver who appeared self-sacrificing. For Gypsy, adolescence arrived without independence. She was presented to the world as younger, sicker, more dependent than she truly was. Yet internally, normal longings began to form: friendship, romantic curiosity, the desire simply to walk without being told it was impossible. She felt the contradiction between her body and her biography. The internet, limited and monitored though it was, provided fleeting windows into other lives, into possibilities beyond the walls of the house. Those glimpses did not immediately inspire rebellion. They inspired questions. Who would she be if the story about her illness were untrue? What would it cost to find out? This first phase of the story is not about crime scenes or courtroom drama. It is about slow erosion, the systematic breaking down of autonomy through medicalization and manipulation. It is about how sympathy can be weaponized, how trust in caregivers can be exploited, and how abuse can wear a mask so convincing that even the victim struggles to name it. The tension that builds through these years is quiet but relentless. Gypsy's life is presented as fragile, yet the most fragile part of it is the truth itself, hidden under layers of diagnosis codes and stage vulnerability. By the time the facade began to tremble, the stakes had become unbearable. A young woman who had been told she was powerless was beginning to understand that some of the limits placed on her were constructed. But the path between realization and freedom was not simple. It led through fear, secrecy, and choices made under extreme psychological pressure. The perfect daughter illusion was cracking, and beneath it stood someone who had never been allowed to grow up in an ordinary way, who had to navigate the most basic question with almost no guidance. What does escape look like when your entire identity has been engineered for you? The story was already moving toward a point from which there would be no return, but in these early chapters the dominant feeling is not sensational shock, it is a slow, accumulating unease. Something is wrong, profoundly wrong, yet almost everyone looking in from the outside believes it is a story about courage. That dissonance is what makes this case unforgettable. Before any headlines about murder, before trials and interviews and documentaries, there was a house filled with medical equipment, a mother endlessly explaining, and a daughter learning day by day that her voice did not matter. The consequences of that silence would echo far beyond the walls where it began. Behind closed doors, life followed rules that were never written down, but always enforced. Days revolve around appointments, pill organizers, and the rhythms of medical routine that seemed never ending. Morning might begin with Dee Dee listing symptoms before Gypsy had time to speak, calling clinics, or reminding her the condition she supposedly had, what outsiders interpreted as caregiving was. For Gypsy, a constant rehearsal of someone else's script. If she forgot a diagnosis, if she asked too many questions, the air in the room changed. Dee Dee's smile would harden, her voice would flatten, and Gypsy understood compliance kept the peace. Curiosity did not. The abuse was subtle in form, but overwhelming in effect. Instead of over-imprisonment, there were softer chains whispered warnings that she was too sick to survive without her mother, that doctors would not understand, that she could die if she missed medication or disobeyed instructions. Paperwork reinforced a narrative, altered birth dates, incomplete records, a trail of medical history that made contradiction difficult. Even when a doctor questioned whether the illnesses matched the test results, the doubt rarely translated into action. The story had momentum. Dee Dee had answers. The busy system moved on. Isolation was not accidental. It was engineered. Schooling happened mostly at home, ostensibly to protect Gypsy's fragile immune system. Phone calls were supervised. Friendships drifted away before they could take root. Visitors saw a cheerful environment, stuffed animals, gifts from charities, bright decorations, but they did not see the unspoken rules. Do not stand when others are watching. Do not challenge a diagnosis. Do not reveal the private conversations in which punishment was hinted at, if not explicitly promised. Gypsy occupied a shrinking world in which the safest thing to be was grateful. At the same time, Dee Dee cultivated an image of tireless devotion. She navigated hospital corridors with practiced competence, listing symptoms on Gypsy's behalf, accepting praise with modest gestures. The contradiction at the heart of the story of the loving caregiver, who was also the architect of the illness narrative, was nearly invisible to those around them. Medical professionals, accustomed to trusting parents, rarely imagined that a caregiver could be the source of harm through exaggeration, fabrication, or unnecessary treatment. The language of sickness covered everything like a blanket. It muffled suspicion and made the extraordinary feel routine. For Gypsy, reality existed in layers. On one level, she believed what she had been told. Years of repetition can make almost anything feel true, especially when combined with medications that cloud thinking and stress that narrows perspective. On another level, she sensed contradiction. She could move her legs more than she was supposed to. She did not always feel as sick as a diagnosis suggested. The tension between those layers was psychologically exhausting. It is difficult to claim an identity you've been taught to doubt, and she had been taught to doubt nearly every signal from her own body. There were moments when the mask slipped. A medical professional would quietly note that a test showed normal results. A friend or neighbor would sense that Gypsy seemed more capable than presented. But challenging Dee Dee meant stepping into conflict, accusing a mother of deception, and risking being wrong. The cost of confrontation felt high. Inaction felt safer. And so the pattern continued, reinforced not only by Dee Dee's control, but by institutional hesitation. In this way, the abuse was both intimate and systemic. It took place in a home, but it survived through collective silence. The emotional dynamic between mother and daughter grew more complicated as Gypsy aged. Dee Dee continued to present her as younger than she was, freezing her in time as a perpetual child. For a teenager, that distortion was profoundly destabilizing. Milestones others took for granted: privacy, romantic interest, simple independence were treated as threats. When Gypsy reached for autonomy, Dee Dee responded not only with discipline, but with narratives of fragility and danger. Even the idea of growing up was framed as impossible. Adulthood belonged to healthy people, and Gypsy had been told she was not one of them. Fear, guilt, and love intertwined until they were difficult to separate. Gypsy did love her mother. Affection and dependency had been intertwined since childhood. She also feared her. That duality is central to understanding the psychological landscape of the case. Abuse does not erase attachment, it complicates it. In private, Dee Dee could be warm, attentive, even playful. Those moments made the harsher ones more confusing. To a child, and later a young woman, it meant that resistance felt like betrayal, not self-defense. Technology became both lifeline and risk. With limited access to the internet, Gypsy began quietly searching for answers about conditions she supposedly had, about medications, about how old she truly was. She discovered that certain facts did not align. She found hints of a broader world where people her age made choices, held jobs, dated, traveled things she'd been told were forever beyond her. These discoveries did not immediately dismantle control in her life, but they shifted her internal narrative. Instead of certainty that she was helpless, there emerged a new, tentative belief, the possibility, however small, that she had been misled. Meanwhile, the community continued to embrace the image of heroic caregiving. Fundraisers were organized. Local news told inspirational stories. The home built for them became a symbol of kindness. No one imagined that the same house held a climate of monitoring and control. That is part why this case later struck such a deep chord of realization that abuse can exist in plain sight, concealed not by secrecy alone, but by a story people want to believe. Compassion, when unexamined, can inadvertently shield harm. Professionals would later identify the pattern as consistent with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a form of abuse in which a caregiver induces or fabricates illness in another to gain attention or control. But during the years it unfolded, those words were absent from daily life. What Gypsy experienced did not come with diagnostic labels. It came as lived reality procedures she did not need, medications that blurred her mind, and the constant assertion that she was incapable of surviving on her own. The cumulative effect was profound. When someone controls your medical identity, they control your future. As adolescence turned into young adulthood, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. Gypsy's curiosity sharpened. Her sense of injustice grew. She secretly practiced standing and walking, testing limits she had been told were fixed. Each step was both liberation and danger. If discovered, there would be consequences. Yet in those private moments, she encountered a version of herself that did not fit the story. Capable, uncertain, but undeniably more independent than she had been allowed to be. It was the beginning of a psychological shift from compliance toward questioning. Still, questioning did not bring easy solutions. To leave required resources she did not have: identification, money, safe support, and emotional resilience that years of control had eroded. It also required a world willing to believe her over the mother everyone admired. That prospect felt nearly impossible. This tension is what defines a behind closed doors period of the case, a slow recognition of truth without an obvious path toward safety. She was not deciding between simple options. She was navigating fear while still trapped inside it. This stage of the story is therefore marked not by sudden explosions of drama, but by accumulation of red flags others missed, of small acts of resistance, of the growing psychological weight of confinement. The harm did not lie only in fabricated illness. It lay in stolen years, in an identity constructed for public consumption, in erasure of agency. And yet, within that controlled environment, a seed of defiance was growing, fed by the realization that her life might be built on lies. As the outside world continued to applaud, the inside world tightened. Restrictions increased when Dee Dee sensed independence forming. Passwords were changed, boundaries redrawn, explanations sharpened. The message was consistent. The world is dangerous. You are incapable, and I am your only protection. That message, repeated often enough, can feel like truth even to someone beginning to doubt it. But doubt, once awakened, is hard to silence completely. By the end of this period, Gypsy was no longer simply the passive recipient of a story. She was an active observer of it, watching the machinery of manipulation with clearer eyes. She understood more than she was allowed to say. She felt more capable than she was allowed to show. The gap between the life she lived and the life she was told she was living had widened to the breaking point. What remained unresolved was how that breaking would happen, and at what cost. The stage was set not through a single dramatic moment, but through years of quiet coercion and misunderstood suffering. Behind closed doors, a young woman learned that her body worked better than she had been told, and that the truth, long suppressed, carried both promise and danger. The next step would not be simple discovery. It would be confrontation with consequences that stretched far beyond her control. The breaking point did not arrive as a sudden explosion. It came as a culmination of years of tension, fear, and awakening. When Gypsy first ventured online in secret, she was not searching for violence, she was searching for connection. Late-night conversations on message boards and social media offered what she had been denied in real life, the chance to be seen as a young woman rather than a permanent patient. It was in this digital space that she met Nicholas Gojan, a man with his own vulnerabilities and troubled history, but most importantly someone who listened to her without filtering her identity through her mother. Their conversations grew intense, imaginative, and emotionally charged. For Gypsy, the relationship became both a lifeline and a catalyst. With Nicholas, she could imagine a version of herself that existed outside the wheelchair, the medications, and the constant supervision. As their communication deepened, Gypsy began to disclose the truth of her situation. Not all at once courage came in increments, but gradually she described the control, the fabricated illnesses, and the impossible feeling of being trapped inside a life designed by someone else. To Nicholas, these revelations were framed not as misbehavior or teenage rebellion, but as pleas for escape. The pair built a fantasy world of future independence, jobs, apartments, ordinary routines that others might see mundane, but to Gypsy felt revolutionary. She was not imagining luxury. She was imagining autonomy. Yet fantasy collided with reality each time she logged off. Dee Dee remained ever present, controlling information, monitoring movements. tightening restrictions as she sensed her daughter growing more self-assured. When Gypsy was discovered communicating online or experimenting with independence, the consequences reaffirmed the risk of disobedience. The more she reached outward, the more confined she became. The house felt smaller. The stakes felt larger. Psychological pressure mounted, not just from the constraints of control, but from the widening gap between the life she was told she must accept and the life she now knew might be possible. The idea of escape began as a wish and hardened into a plan. Only when Gypsy convinced herself there was no safe institutional path out. From her perspective shaped by years of manipulation, no one would believe her. She feared that reporting the truth would simply return her to the same home, under even stricter control, possibly punished for disloyalty. When systems fail to recognize abuse, they send a message: silence is safer. And Gypsy had learned that lesson repeatedly. Every missed red flag, every unquestioned diagnosis, every charity visit reinforced a belief that the world was inclined to side with her mother. Her conversations with Nicholas intensified under that belief. They discussed ways to be together, then ways to leave, and eventually the darkest possibility of eliminating the source of control altogether. It is crucial to understand this not as an instant transformation into malice, but as a product of desperation, immaturity, dependency, and fear. None of those factors erase responsibility, but they explain how the unthinkable can begin to feel like the only door left unlocked. Gypsy was not texting from a position of freedom and safety. She was making catastrophic decisions from inside a psychological cage. The day events finally unfolded was not cinematic, but painfully human. There was no grand confrontation or shouted confession echoing through the walls. Instead, there were messages exchanged, plans synchronized, and a moment in which Nicholas entered the house while Gypsy retreated to another room, covering her ears, waiting for the life she had always known to end. What occurred was irreversible: the death of Dee Dee Blanchard, a woman who had for years controlled every aspect of her daughter's existence and who also, undeniably, was a mother. The act did not liberate Gypsy the way fantasy had promised. It left shock, grief, disorientation, and an aftermath far more complicated than any plan had considered. In the immediate hours that followed, Gypsy's actions reflected both naivety and trauma. She and Nicholas left town, attempting to step into the adult world she had imagined but for which she had never been prepared. They mailed the weapon, stayed in hotel rooms, and made purchases that seemed almost ordinary compared to the enormity of what had just taken place. Online, messages appeared from Gypsy's account that drew attention and alarm, prompting friends and neighbors to contact authorities. What looked from the outside like callousness was, in truth, a chaotic blend of panic, shock, and a lack of understanding about how consequences operate beyond the confines of abuse. The discovery of Dee Dee's body stunned the community. The woman they had known as a tireless caregiver, the symbol of devotion, was suddenly the victim of a homicide. Rumors spread before facts could catch up. Sympathy turned to confusion. Confusion turned to disbelief as investigators uncovered details that contradicted the long-standing narrative of illness. When Gypsy was found not frail, not bound to a wheelchair, able to walk on her own, the shock deepened. Headlines shifted tone rapidly, from tragedy to scandal to something more complex that resisted easy categorization. Investigators began to reconstruct the story with new information. Medical records were examined more closely. Inconsistencies multiplied. Old doubts voiced quietly by a few physicians now echoed loudly in the public conversation. Many of Gypsy's reported illnesses had no medical basis. The picture emerging was not simply a case of a daughter complicit in her mother's death. It was a case shaped by years of fabricated sickness, coercion, and psychological manipulation consistent with Munchausen by proxy. What had appeared to be a selfless caregiver now looked like an abuser who had rewritten her child's entire identity. For Gypsy, interrogation rooms replaced hospital rooms. Instead of doctors asking about symptoms, investigators asked about motives. For the first time, she spoke openly about the control, the threats, the unnecessary treatments, the isolation, the punishments about a life that, once described plainly, sounded like captivity wrapped in a language of care. Listeners alternated between shock and sorrow. The legal system, however, does not weigh only stories. It weighs actions. And the action at the center of the case was the deliberate killing of Dee Dee Blanchard, carried out by Nicholas with Gypsy's participation in planning. This is where the moral landscape of the case becomes most fraught. Two truths coexist. Dee Dee was an abuser whose actions caused profound harm, and Dee Dee was also the victim of homicide. Gypsy was a victim of long-term psychological and medical abuse, and Gypsy also helped orchestrate the killing. There's discomfort in refusing to simplify these truths. Yet, refusing simplification is essential to understanding the case honestly. People wanted a clear villain and a clear hero. What they found instead was a tragedy born of manipulation, desperation, and systemic failure. When charges were filed, public opinion fractured. Some argued that Gypsy should be treated primarily as a survivor of abuse who had been pushed into a corner with no support or recognition from authorities. Others emphasized that taking a life cannot be excused, regardless of circumstances. That divide would grow even wider in the months and years to come, fueled by documentaries, interviews, and online debates. But in the immediate aftermath, what mattered most was the recognition that the systems meant to protect vulnerable children had repeatedly missed warnings, and that the final outcome was not only a crime, but a preventable catastrophe. Gypsy's emotional state during this period is difficult to summarize without oversimplification. She experienced grief for the woman who had hurt her and raised her, relief at escaping a life built on lies, fear of punishment, and uncertainty about who she even was without the illnesses that had defined her. The relationship with Nicholas, once imagined as rescue, now carried the weight of irreversible consequences. Freedom did not feel like triumph. It felt like standing in the open for the first time, without a script, facing both possibility and judgment. The breaking point, then, was not only the night of the killing. It was the entire sequence of realizations, missteps, and desperate decisions that led there, each shaped by years of manipulation and a lack of safe alternatives. What might have happened if earlier suspicions had been pursued, if Gypsy had been believed sooner, if mental health intervention had occurred? These questions linger around the case like unresolved echoes. By the time the investigation ended and charges were formalized, the narrative had fully inverted. The once idealized caregiver was revealed as an abuser. The supposedly helpless daughter was revealed as capable of movement, thought, and planning. The community that had rallied in compassion now struggled with betrayal and empathy at once. The story no longer fit easily into categories of good and evil. It became a case study in how prolonged psychological abuse distorts perception, constrains choices, and can lead to outcomes that are both tragic and criminal. As the legal process moved forward, the public fascination only grew. But beneath the headlines and debate remained a human core. A young woman who had grown up being told she could not survive on her own had made a devastating decision in the pursuit of autonomy. The consequences for her, for Nicholas, and for the memory of Dee Dee were only beginning to unfold. Courtrooms are not built to hold contradictions comfortably, but this case forced everyone inside to sit with them. When proceedings began, the image of Gypsy Rose that appeared in court was starkly different from the persona the public had known for years. She walked on her own. She spoke clearly. There were no feeding tubes, no wheelchairs, no medical paraphernalia surrounding her. For many observers, that alone was disorienting, a visible dismantling of a story that had once generated so much sympathy. Yet the absence of medical devices did not erase what she had lived through. It only made the deception and abuse more undeniable. The legal process focused on responsibility, but the emotional undercurrent was about context. Prosecutors presented the facts of the crime, the planning, the messages, the role Nicholas played, the steps that led to Dee Dee's death. Defense attorneys emphasized the years of psychological and medical abuse, the manipulation consistent with Munchausen by proxy, and the impact such prolonged coercive control has on judgment. Expert testimony illuminated how identity, agency, and perception are reshaped under chronic abuse, how a person who has never been allowed to make ordinary choices may misjudge the boundaries of possible ones. Ultimately, Gypsy accepted a plea agreement, acknowledging her role while also recognizing the circumstances that shaped it. She was sentenced to prison time, and her acceptance of responsibility came with a complicated mixture of remorse, grief, and relief. Not relief at her mother's death, but relief that the truth of her life had finally been spoken aloud and believed. Nicholas, tried separately, received a much harsher sentence. Their legal outcomes diverged, reflecting not only differing roles in the crime, but differing assessment of capacity, intent, and vulnerability. In the months and years that followed, the story moved from courtroom to culture. Documentaries, long-form articles, dramatizations, and online debates transformed the case into a broader conversation about abuse, autonomy, and blame. Viewers confronted a narrative that resisted simple labels. Was Gypsy primarily a victim who made a terrible decision inside an impossible situation? Was she a perpetrator who must be held fully accountable regardless of her past? The answer many arrived at was uneasy. She was both. That duality remains the emotional axis of the case. One of the most striking elements of the aftermath was Gypsy's transformation inside prison. Paradoxically, Incarceration brought freedoms. She had never known freedom to choose her clothing, to keep her hair, to decide what and when to eat, to walk independently without permission. Interviews captured a young woman learning adulthood for the first time while already serving time for an adult crime. She spoke about guilt and about love for a mother who had also been her abuser. She described the shock of discovering that her body was capable, that many of her supposed conditions had never existed, and the anger and sadness that realization unleashed. The ethical questions surrounding the case extend beyond individual blame into systemic responsibility. Multiple institutions intersected with Dee Dee and Gypsy over the years: hospitals, charities, social services, schools, neighbors, law enforcement. At various points, documentation discrepancies surfaced. Doctors suspected fabricated illness, and inconsistencies in age and diagnosis appeared. Yet action stalled. The reluctance to challenge a devoted caregiver combined with fragmented records and the social pressure to be compassionate toward a seemingly fragile child. The lesson is uncomfortable but necessary. Sympathy without scrutiny can allow abuse to flourish in plain sight. The case also drew broader attention to Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now more widely referred to as factitious disorder imposed on another. It highlighted how this form of abuse operates through medical authority, social reinforcement, and emotional manipulation rather than overt physical violence alone. Victims of this disorder often struggle later with identity. If your childhood is built around illnesses that were never yours, who are you when those are taken away? Gypsy's story became a public example of that struggle, but countless cases remain quieter, less visible, sometimes never recognized at all. As time passed, public opinion continued to evolve. Many people who initially saw Gypsy only as a perpetrator came to better understand the depth of her victimization. Others maintained that empathy for her past should not overshadow accountability for her actions. That tension is precisely what keeps the case alive in public memory. It forces a confrontation with how trauma can shape choices and how the legal system grapples imperfectly with those complexities. It also raises a haunting counterfactual. What if intervention had occurred earlier? The answer cannot change the past, but it can shape future vigilance. For Gypsy herself, the years following her sentencing were marked by introspection and reconstruction. She began to articulate boundaries between compassion for her mother and recognition of the abuse she endured. That separation is neither easy nor complete. Grief and betrayal remain intertwined. She has spoken about missing the woman who raised her while also acknowledging the harm that woman caused. In that acknowledgement lies one of the story's deepest truths. Love does not cancel abuse, and abuse does not erase love. They coexisted in her life, and their coexistence led to tragedy. The cultural fascination with the case carries risks. Turning real trauma into entertainment can flatten nuance or sensationalize suffering. Yet when handled responsibly, the story serves as a lens on psychological manipulation, the invisibility of certain kinds of abuse, and the ways systems fail those who fall between their categories. It invites viewers and readers to question easy judgments and to recognize that "why did not she just leave?" is not a meaningful question when someone has been systematically deprived of tools, trust, and identity. Today, the legacy of the case is layered. It lives in legal records, in documentaries, in academic discussions of coercive control and factitious disorder, and in the lives of people who saw parts of their own experiences reflected in Gypsy's. It has prompted conversations about reporting suspicions of abuse, about listening to children's voices in medical settings, and about the need for careful evaluation when symptoms and test results diverge. It has also served as a cautionary tale about the seductive power of narratives centered on heroic caregiving and miraculous suffering. At its core, though, the story remains deeply human rather than abstract. It is a story of a child who grew up in a world where illness was identity, dependence was mandatory, and autonomy was framed as danger. It is a story of a mother whose need for control and attention built a reality that consumed them both. And it is a story of crime that emerged not from simple malice, but from years of fear, confusion, and a collapse of trust in every possible escape route. The final question, victim or perpetrator, does not have a single word answer. Gypsy Rose Blanchard is both a survivor of prolonged, complex abuse and someone who participated in taking a life. Dee Dee Blanchard is both a victim of homicide and the architect of a damaging illusion that reshaped her daughter's existence. Recognizing these overlapping truths does not excuse wrongdoing, nor does it minimize suffering. Instead, it acknowledges the messy reality that human lives and human systems rarely fit clean moral categories. The story ends without easy closure. There is accountability, but not full resolution. Understanding, but not justification. empathy, but not erasure of consequences. What remains is a somber recognition of how layered harm can be and how urgently society must learn to see beyond appearances when a narrative of illness and devotion seems too perfect to question. In that recognition lies the only fragment of redemption available, the hope that future gypsies might be believed before desperation turns into disaster. Gypsy's journey beyond the case continues rebuilding identity, navigating adulthood, and carrying the weight of choices made under unbearable pressure. The echo of her story asks us to hold two truths at once: that abuse can drive people to desperate actions, and that desperate actions still wound irrevocably. Between those truths lies the drama of ethics that captivated the world, not because it was sensational, but because it was painfully, recognizably human.